it's time for me to introduce our next speaker, who is the wonderful, amazing, and fabulously talented Eduardo de Silva, who's talking about Towards Architecture Organization Topologies for Sustainable Fast Flow of Change. Give him a big round of applause. Come on! Okay, Eduardo, you can come up now. Be nice to him.
Hi, everyone. I know everyone is looking for lunchtime. I hope this is a sort of an appetizer, although architecture has not been the most fashionable dish over the last few years. But today I hope I can get you excited about some interesting ideas I've been exploring. And as you can see, I have like a work in progress sign there. This is rather experimental still, but I think there is a lot of value on start thinking about these. And this is about architecture and how can we think about architecture, how to organize architecture more realistically so that we can achieve this idea of sustainable fast flow of change. Before we go into the architecture part, I want to just spend some time telling you about what is this idea of sustainable fast flow of change. So, as organizations, we are not something that lives in isolation. We live in an environment. We have some external things that are continuously affecting us. Our customers, our competitors, technological changes. Just see the crazy, every company is implementing something with ChatGPT nowadays. It came up, we are doing something with that. But we also have things that are changing internally, like we changed our business strategy. How quickly and how sustainably can we change things within our organization to basically be able to respond to that? So this is the idea of sustainable fast flow of change. And why am I speaking about this? Why Manuel spoke about this in the morning? Why many people are talking about this? Because the rate of change on technical innovation, market expectations, customer expectations has just exploded over the last, say, 4 or 5 decades. So I was born roughly 40 years ago, 42 tomorrow, and I had no computer when I was growing up. I was just playing around on the streets. Nowadays, just see how kids are, since they are born, they have all of these things around them. Whether it's good or bad, well, I'm not going to go there, but there is a lot of technical innovation happening. However, the way our organizations are operating, we didn't see a similar rate of change there. We have Agile, we have DevOps, a few things that today we already heard that are rather applicable on the engineering part of the organization. But what about the rest? How are we doing? And in general, what you see is still rather bureaucratic and controlling structures in our organizations. How we decide, how we design things needs to go a few levels up, a few levels down, which basically brings us to the question, but somehow we are delivering those technical innovations, right? So we are doing them. However, I think we are doing that by stretching our social systems, the teams we have, the projects we make to grind and deliver something. And at the end, by doing that, we are just creating more complex processes or more complex social structures within the organization. And as probably all of you know about Conway's law, so if we have those complex social structures happening, that will be reflected on the technical systems that we are building continuously. So what we are doing in time is just adding more and more complexity, which makes it even harder to bring innovations and go forward. So the outcome is that we tend to fight a lot against this environment because we keep on having things happening around us, more customer expectations, new competitor coming up, we need to do something on that. But also internally, because as we are making our technical systems more complex, well, then next time we need to add something on top of them, it will be more difficult to do it. So basically, what I want to argue a bit today is that a lot of these old org structures and operating models are really hindering us and limiting our ability to achieve this fast flow of change sustainably. So we may need to start accepting that we are not a factory from the 40s that knows exactly what we need to do. We need to embrace that our market is so unpredictable and complex that we just don't know what we will be doing in a few months' time. So we need to be able to respond to that. And these structures tend to be not really aligned to allow for that. So I think we need to make a sort of a breakthrough and embrace that we need to have a bigger change on how we operate our organizations. It's not okay to just keep on adding another little small process on our own engineering teams. We need to do something bigger. And that requires to have quite a few changes on how we should operate as an organization. One of them, and this is something that we sort of think, but I don't think many organizations are really doing it, is accepting that we are not a factory, a closed system that is not being continuously affected. We are, in fact, an open system. We are continuously getting signs. We are learning from our environment, and we want to do something about that. Are our operating models doing that? I don't think all the organizations are yet doing this. So, going into operating models where there is a culture and structures that nurture for that, like we are open, we can learn from our environment, and then use that to be able to design and also decide, seems to be fundamental. And this would mean moving away from this idea that we are just this well-defined, clear factory where we just get some things that we need to do, we get it done, and then we ship it, to something that is more on these lines, like we will have an environment where we are continuously being affected by this environment. There are expectations that are changing all the time, and that's fine. And our organizations, our teams, how we set them up, should be able to listen to that continuously. It's not just someone doing that on behalf of the teams, are the teams able to do that? And this is where stories from and ideas from team topologies are picking up quite a lot and resonating with a lot of people. Like, can we set up our teams so that they can listen to their environment and then use that to basically evolve the products that they are owning and driving and building? But are we also supporting them with enough conditions so that they can do that? Do they have platform support, as Manuel mentioned in the morning? Are we helping them to upskill? Are we thinking about all of these things? Because the thing is, because we are continuously being affected by our environment, this is not going to stop. So we are not building a box that we send away and then we forget about it. Most of us work on things that are continuously changing. So our teams, if they have enough conditions, they will be building and evolving this, and we can just assume that this is never stopping, unless we go out of business, which is probably not something we want to do. So I talked about team topologies as a way to start thinking on how can we organize these teams and start having a better language to do that. And very originally, 2 years ago, I got triggered by an article on how are we approaching architecture on our teams. And I started thinking a lot about this. And I started using this name, Architecture Topologies, because the idea is I would bet that all of your organizations have a different way of approaching architecture. We are all different. It's normal. And as such, we also need sort of languages that allow us to talk about that, understand where we are, and maybe opportunities that we can have to improve. And this is, in a nutshell, the idea of architecture topologies. And it's not just about where we are and how do we improve, it's also embracing that in our organizations we will always be changing how we approach architecture. And that's also fine. We should embrace that, because our environment is changing, our strategies are changing, and as such, maybe we also need to change on how are we learning, designing, and approaching decision-making. I talk a lot about these three things. So when I talk about architecture, I don't just think about designing. I talk a lot about the ability to learn, to inform, designing, and then also decision-making. Because if we want to go to these ideas of fast flow of change, we want to go from the idea to something in front of the customer as fast as we can and as we need. So we need to be able to learn, design, and also decide. Looking at some of these, what are typical key dimensions to think when I'm thinking about these ideas of architecture topologies? One of them is what I was already alluding to, evolution. So we will be changing how we approach architecture continuously. The article I wrote about was triggered by this article from Gregor Hopi. You probably, if you are into architecture, you heard about him. He's a very popular person on architecture. And he wrote, he talked about sort of, in teams, you have like you could think about like 4 categories of how teams can approach or are approaching architecture. This is actually not from Gregor. This originally comes from this German book on software architecture by Stefan Toth. And I think this covers quite a lot of the ways we normally approach architecture on teams. And this can give us sort of 4 categories of architecture topologies. On your leftmost side, you have something that I don't think nowadays many organizations are there anymore, but just things are happening. No one cares about architecture. Things are happening, and yeah, Gregor mentioned this would be inmates running the asylum. Just things are just happening. If you would be there, a way to get better or to improve, and I think this happened a lot over the last few decades, is maybe there is someone that is the architect. Someone that would be designing and making decisions, and teams implementing something on that. As you can see, there is like an exclamation mark there, because this is a dangerous territory, right? So this is like if you look at the lines, this is just a one-way street, like the architect is just telling the team. However, if this is used strategically, and I was in this position in, like, I think 7, 8 years ago, you can leverage this as a way to coach that team to actually be able to drive architecture themselves. And you can eventually go into this topology number 3, which is architecture is being driven from within the team. So someone in the team would take the role of architect. And here you start getting into some interesting elements, which is the team is listening to their environment. They are able to learn, to design, and to decide within that team. They don't need to wait on someone outside. But if this person gets sick, if this person gets whatever, then we may have an issue. And this number 4 would be another level of evolving, and where no particular person in the team is driving architecture, could be multiple people. Maybe not everyone is interested on that, but maybe there are several people doing that. So these sort of cover rather, I would say, probably most of the situations we can think of how to approach architecture in teams. And the very interesting thing, and this is why I think this is a very important topic for organizations to think about, is that if you start thinking about improving architecture, you start seeing parallels on the organization's ability to achieve this sustainable fast flow of change. The more you go to the right, the team is probably more capable of responding faster and sustainably to changes. And the other part, and this is sort of like foundational for this to happen, is that the organization culture and traits also tend to relate a lot here. So if you are more into the left side, you probably have like a culture where, well, there is some controlling way of taking decisions, right? So you need to wait someone up there, maybe the architecture board will need to decide, and then a few weeks after we can proceed. So decision making is slow. Other properties of these, or traits of these organizations, are also the fact that tend to be bureaucratic. And as Ron Westrum talks about on his work, can even be pathological. So people are a bit afraid of participating of discussions around architecture and whatever, even in the organization, because it tends to have like a culture of heroes. There are a few people that will solve things and will get things done. If you start moving more to the right, so improving how you approach architecture, but also trying to improve the culture and structure of your organization, you can get into models where probably everyone can feel more empowered to be part of architecture and driving design and decision-making of things on their teams. There you start also having sort of the advantages of having much faster decisions being made. So you are not waiting anymore on going up to the architecture board. People trust more each other and sort of decentralizing decision making, which sounds scary, but keep in mind that you are sort of maturing your organization to get there. So this is not a transformation project of a few months and then you are there. So it's something that you need to build onto. And fundamentally, if you start coming here to the right, you are more on, again, referring to Ron Westrum's work, you are on what he calls a learning organization. So people are learning from each other. Learning is flowing in the organization. And if that is flowing on the organization, teams are aware of what's happening around them. So they can decide better. They don't need to wait and go because they learned. Learning is being shared. So everyone feels empowered to drive decisions. So I talk teams, but what about architecture across the organization? So what happens across teams and across the whole organization? Because the organization is not teams in isolation, as we had very strongly, like the sort of blind, agile, pure team autonomy was very strong up over the last 2 decades or so. But the fact is, a team tends to be part of a bigger scope. There is something that the team belongs to, if it's a reasonably complex organization and not a one-team startup. And as Russell Aikoff said, so if you start thinking a system is more than a sum of its parts. It will lose essential properties when it's taken apart. And what it does mean with this is the fact that think of building the best car in the world. And now you have isolated teams, and each team, the engine team, will build the best engine. The chassis team will build the best chassis. The whatever windows build the best window. And then at the end, you say, okay, now bring it together. And it will not be the best car. They didn't talk with each other. They don't know what they are building. So pure autonomy and teams being in isolation doesn't make sense in most organizations. We want to strive for value streams that are rather independent, so we are not talking every single thing we need to do, but we need to know where we are going. Ruth Malan talks a lot about this on her workshops and workbook, and it's essential to embrace that decisions will cross boundaries. We need to think about that when we are approaching architecture. It's almost never in a single team. And as such, we need to also embrace that we need to have ways of handling and those discussions and having conversations around that. This is just an example of how an organization could look like if you start putting teams in context of bigger scopes. So you may have a team that owns a value stream, a set of services rather independently, but they tend to be part of a bigger scope, which could be a product. And you want all of those multiple teams that are part of that product to build something that makes sense to be together, right? So I used to work on the biggest online retailer in the Netherlands and Belgium, and early 2010s, we had all the DevOps teams, strong autonomy. They built. They still have the motto: you build it, you run it, you love it. Like teams really had this strong sense of ownership, but we were not thinking too much about that following scope. So we had our recommendations team optimizing for something, our search team optimizing for something else. And then the customers were coming in, and we were losing because they were sort of conflicting with each other. Recently, we started having some of that scope to define and align more on those. What are we doing? What should we be doing in recommendations, but not mess up each other's work? What we are building should improve the properties of that system there. If you have bigger organizations, you may have other scopes around that. Groups of products that make sense together, etc., etc. So, in a sense, what we want to do is to start thinking about architecture on teams, but also around the different scopes of the organization. And this brings this other key dimension that I think is essential when we are thinking about these ideas of architecture topologies or how we approach architecture. And if you create a sort of a map, what you start getting is something like this. So on the x-axis, you have all of those sort of evolution of how we are approaching architecture. But then you also want to see how are we approaching in terms of the whole organization. Because it tends to vary a lot. How we do things in teams, how we do across teams, how we do maybe organization-wide or enterprise architecture-wide, for example. So just to get you a bit of a feeling of how this looks like, and I will just walk through these three sorts of group types of architecture topologies that I've experienced and I've seen rather often. Here you have like one that I think is still the most common. And here you see sort of oops, my clicker is not working. But so basically, how are we approaching architecture in teams, multi-team, etc. In the middle, you have what I see as a sort of a trend coming up. And then on the right side, some pioneers are looking there. So I want to just get your minds going through these and see what sorts of things are there and how can you think of opportunities to move forward on these. So the first one, this is about architects designing and deciding and teams mostly executing. If we zoom into those two first scopes that I talked about, this is what it tends to look like. So architect is driving the decision making. So someone that is looking at these across teams scope. And if you see organizations moving more to the right here, that person is probably helping teams to improve their architecture ability or capability so that they can eventually be doing this themselves. This, eventually, the architect is going to become a bottleneck on these sort of situations. I've lived this, and I think this is something that probably architects relate a lot with. When you work with many teams, there will be moments that you cannot help everyone. You are not able to go and help teams on all the different sorts of things. But I think the thing that is even worse is that the architect will not have all the knowledge that the teams have firsthand of the problems that are happening on their scope. And that we are missing opportunities to learn, design, and decide faster or better. So what can we do here if we want to think of opportunities to move to the right side here is thinking of can the architect move from being this designer and decider into being facilitator and enabler of learning and design and decision making for the teams? Can we start thinking of ways of doing that? And then can the team take more ownership and actually be able to drive architecture? And this is what I'm seeing as a sort of a trend. Many organizations are noticing this, like the architect moving and becoming this multi-team enabling architect. Again, going into ideas from team topologies of facilitating teams to improve and not necessarily do the design and decision-making for them. And then there will be someone in the teams that take more ownership of driving architecture. And we would come into something more like this. So the architect is still there, but there are these green interactions are more about facilitating. Maybe he will still participate of some things that concern to like multi-team decisions that it's not clear where things should be. But the architect will not be every single time on the table designing and being the single one designing. Well, to me this is much more scalable and is a big step forward. But again, coming back to Gregor's, when I talked about those 4 topologies, this person, the single person designing on the team and taking decisions, that person may also become overloaded or may not always be there. And it's always the same group. There are people there that are not part of decision making. So, can we go forward? Maybe this is okay for many organizations, the topology I just shared, but are you seeing that you are still not being able to respond quickly enough to your environment, to opportunities that you have? Then you may explore some other ways to improve. Namely, can architecture just be done in the team without having a particular individual doing that? Can we introduce some sort of practices and elements that allow for more distributed decision making? Think like ADRs or RFCs, where you can have multiple people collaborating in order to learn and see how can we decide this. But more than anything, do we have the foundational culture and structures where everyone would be okay to be part of driving architecture or design and decision making? I want to just go into a bit of this idea, the advice process. I'm not sure if many of you heard about this, but this is a very interesting work that Andrew here has been writing a lot about and speaking a lot about. And if we want to move into that more distributed way of approaching architecture, these are very cool ideas to keep in mind, to strive for. Because basically, the problem we are trying to solve is that there is a decision that needs to be made. If we have here the architect in the middle, he or she may be okay for a while, but eventually we know this person will not be able to cope with all these requests. And then we have sad people here on the other side, waiting for things to eventually come to them. So what the advice process is this single page here. It's a very interesting idea, which basically says anyone can make a decision. However, before doing that, they must. I did a red there. They must. It's not optional. They must seek advice from all affected parties and people that are experts on that topic. So think you are changing an API, you talk with your customers, the people that are using your API. They will be part of this discussion. You are introducing, I don't know, GraphQL on that API, and there is another team that is doing that for a long time. They must be part of the discussion, or someone that knows about that. However, the interesting thing is that the team may decide to not take the advice. The team may decide, no, we think this should be slightly different. And it sounds contradictory, but what this idea strives for is to have a sort of information and knowledge coming to the team so that they have all of that in consideration before deciding and going for something. And I think most of the times they will take this advice, right? So they will listen to their customers, listen to the experts, and just use that. But it's a very interesting idea. So what we achieve with this is basically we stop having this central person that is the only one that is controlling the design and decision making, and we start involving here on the advice zone the people that are affected and the people that know about the thing that we are doing. So this allows for for a lot of interesting things to happen, namely learning. A lot of learning happens here. This is not something very common. And Andrew and a few other friends last year on the DDD Europe keynote, they did an exercise with everyone that was on the keynote. It was like 800 people about experience this idea of advice process. And then they asked us a few questions. One was this one, like, what worries you about the advice process? And you can see the sort of answers that we gave. Well, decision-making skills. Is the team capable of deciding? Advice-giving skills. Are people really advising well enough? Control. Coherence. Trust. These are all things that are ingrained on our brains as we are educated, where we work, the way we work, where normally all of these things tend to show up. We want to control, we want to make sure things are okay. And sort of this highlighted a lot of things that are part of our culture, in a sense. I was more positive here, so there I got, okay, we still may need to do some work, but people were rather excited actually about this idea and confident. I was expecting actually a bit more to the left, but it was rather okay. Not many people were very negative on this sort of idea. I think people see the value on this. And the last question they asked about was, what could make you more confident about this? And these are things that, as you are moving to the right on that, maturing the way you approach architecture, I think these are very interesting points to keep in mind. For example, starting small and get the organization to learn and experience that this is okay. Because then you can sort of build trust, and people feel more safe that not everything is going to be breaking if we start adopting these sort of things. Again, building that base of more like culture and ways of working that embrace this sort of ideas. Transparency, fail safety, so people feeling safe of doing this sort of things. Will I be blamed if I decided wrong? If everyone decides, people will feel a bit that those feelings that architects tend to feel a lot nowadays. But so if we start getting all of this together, we come into this topology that I don't think many of us experience. I never experienced a full thing like this. Maybe some glimpses of what this is about, where you basically have your team and your multi-team and even your organization. There is a lot of things that everybody is being part of that discussion. We are learning and we are deciding in more together. So this would mean something, these sort of traits that you have here. So team owns the architecture decisions on their scope. There is no single person doing that. Everyone is part of it. You may still, I think it's still very powerful to have people there around the teams. Although people can argue, well, if everyone is deciding, why do we need an architect there? Well, that person may be sort of helping teams to upskill on things that they are missing, or bringing insights that they are getting from other parts of the organization that the teams are not getting. So how can you maximize learning, in a sense? Yeah, so you start getting this decentralized decision-making going on and learning. And this is what I taught earlier, like you start going into this idea of a learning organization. Because we are not just designing and deciding, but we are mostly learning with each other and using that to design and decide. The last point I write there, and what we saw from this survey done on the previous slides, is to operate here, you must have a culture of trust and safety. So if that's not there, well, you can forget to sort of start adopting these things on, say, next week you go back to work. That should be there. And there are a lot of things that need to happen. Those two books talk about companies that are sort of doing these things already. There are some interesting examples there if you want to check out, like, how are things happening there. So the bottom line here is architecture will be different in different organizations, and some organizations may be okay being here closer to the 2, some organizations may need to come closer to the 3, some organizations may need to go over. But the point is, this tends to be a journey of developing that in the organization, but also building the culture and structures that the organization allows for that to happen. So it's very important to, I know there are frameworks for approaching architecture, but each organization will be different. And I think this is the essential thing to keep in mind after my talk today. So how could you start thinking or start doing some of these things? This is not going to be something tomorrow you go back to work and you just start doing this, but keep these things in mind. Like, where are we on this map? Where are our teams? How are we approaching architecture across the teams? What are the sorts of challenges that we have there? Is that enough to allow us to respond quickly to our environment? Like that idea of sustainable fast flow of change? If not, which opportunities are there that we could explore? And more than anything is, how can you start bringing those learnings into your operating model? Like, how can we start asking us these questions continuously? And that basically closes my story. I have much more of these ideas boiling, and there is a lot of things behind this that I will be writing about, and you can check my contacts here if you are interested in talking about this. Yeah, but this is basically my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. We have 3 minutes and 50 seconds for questions. Are you ready to take them?
Sure.
Okay, question number 1 from Sergey. Architecture topologies are focusing on software owned by a team. What about system architecture and across-domain systems?
Yes. Yes. So if you remember when I showed that example of that product scope where you had multiple scopes, for example, the organization I was working with, we had on the product scope, we had someone called a product architect. So that person was more engaged on doing the multi-team scope architecture. And there were even more on bigger scopes, also people driving that. So yeah, in a nutshell, as these scopes, if you are introducing those scopes, I think it's highly advised of having people that are there and are empowered to drive architecture on those scopes. That would be my answer.
Okay, thank you, Sergey. Next up, Anonymous. How could this work in highly regulated industries with lots of compliance like banking or healthcare?
Well, to be honest, I think this would help a lot there. Because Manuel talked about this in the morning, this together with ideas of platforms, etc. But understanding where you are and what sorts of, how you should be approaching architecture on that line, on such an organization would be very interesting. For example, maybe there you should always have that scope architecture being more driving architecture, being more in control of decisions. Maybe that's very different from like an e-commerce web shop where probably you want decisions to be faster. So decisions that don't need to be so fast, but they need to be consistent. But this would definitely work there. So just to be clear, I don't want you to think that you should be on the rightmost side. You need to understand where you should be in your organization. That would be my answer.
Okay, next up, Peter asks, what are the key properties of a good architect working in this model?
Yeah, so this model, we saw a lot of different architects, right? Like on the leftmost side, you have probably that classical ivory tower. But I think the key, as you move to the right, is to moving into the idea of what I was calling an enabling architect. So how can an architect step back from driving design and decision making to how can he or she facilitate teams or the scopes that are working, the sub-scopes that are under his responsibility to do better. Like, to me, this is the key, this would be the key properties or the key goals for this, for say, modern architects. Not just controlling, but allowing people to go and help them upskill or help them doing better in a sense.
Oh, now I'm on. Okay, last one. How can you stop working? We should stop that question now. But anyway, how can you stop working and develop in silos, in projects implemented by 20 external suppliers without common architecture community and common design mindset?
Yeah, so this would be very much on the left here, right? One of the things that I didn't go so far to the left because I think it's probably not many companies are there. I know that quite some are still, but I think one of the keys to start doing that is looking for boundaries. Can we start identifying those scopes of things that are done together? Because then you can start thinking of, can we organize teams that would own these boundaries? And can we start having them moving more to the right and owning some sort of design and decision making? I know that this is not trivial, but it's something that you could start thinking of to start improving on how you approach architecture and even on those very complex situations.
Eduardo, thank you very much. Everyone, warm round of applause for Eduardo again.